I still have kind of a vivid memory from the days of the Civil War.
My entire childhood is marked by the Civil War. I don't know if I have memories outside the Civil War, actually.
One time I was at home and my mother was cooking French fries and escalope. Once we were about to start eating, bombs started falling next to our house.
We lived in a religiously mixed neighborhood and we were kicked out of the house. So this is my first memory.
And I still remember that my dad, he asked us to run to the car, and then my mom refused not to bring the food, so we had to wait for her until she packed the food in a bag. We put them in the car and we fled.
For a year, we were moving from place to place to place. The entire memories are paved around when we fled this house to stay with these people, and then when these people fled their house and come and stay with us. And really, your entire childhood is built around that idea.
I think we fled to south of Lebanon, where my uncle had a house. And I still remember that when we came back after a few days, it was a little bit quiet. We thought that it was over, but it wasn't.
And it wouldn't be for 15 years. That's a long time for any war to last, and Lebanon seemed like an unusual setting for a war of this nature. Modest in size, culturally rich, ethnically diverse, and dramatically scenic. Its capital, Beirut, earned itself the Orientalist title of Paris of the Middle East, a description that robs it of its individual identity. But maybe, in a way, it also offers an honest reflection of Lebanon's fate. Divided, invaded, carved up and corrupted, somewhere along the way its sovereignty comes into question as warlords and foreign powers fight to control it. Conflict breaks out between countless political parties and their militias. Alliances shift over time, and outside interventionist forces exploit the chaos for their own interests. Lebanon's civil war killed 150,000 people. It depleted the country's public resources and led to a spiral of turmoil for years to come. So, what remains today in its wake? This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. In this episode, we mark the 50th anniversary of Lebanon's civil war, with a look back at the events that shaped it and a complicated legacy that still takes hold of the country today.
Once the shelling starts, the whole building used to move to the stairs, so we sit on the stairs next to the elevator.
This is Mohammed Ali Harisi, the National's foreign editor, or casually as we call him, Ali. Ali lived through the war in Lebanon.
And everyone was out there. We were talking with the neighbors. The only person who would stay in the apartment was my dad. And because he was scared and his safe place was the bathtub. And I always, everyone was there just talking, and my dad was, carrying the radio in his hand and sitting in the bathtub in the bathroom.
Ali's memories are like postcards from a war, static snapshots of a dynamic experience. And even though they're personal moments, they also represent a collective memory of an entire generation.
One time there was heavy shelling, and my grandfather decided to take us all somewhere else in the mountains. So we went into the car, and he started driving, and we reached somewhere in the mountains where we had to stop at a checkpoint. And they asked for the IDs, and they saw that we're not from the same religion where the majority of the residents of this area were, so they wouldn't let us in. So we had to go back and drive for hours and hours until we found a village or a town that accepted that we go and hide there.
But at the root of these experiences is a single common denominator: sectarian division.
Both of my parents, who were very poor, low income, children of farmers in South Lebanon on the edge, were somehow found in a set of circumstances that someone felt for them and sent them to Beirut.
Mona Fawaz is a professor of urban studies and planning at the American University of Beirut.
So both of them were very secular. And we grew up in a very secular space where we didn't have religious lessons. We didn't know what we quote unquote were. And then when you grow up, people start classifying. Beirut remained mixed, and we always had Christian families, although the area was under the large control of Muslim militias. And definitely some were harassed. At some point, one of my classmates' dad was kidnapped for a ransom. So you start seeing people leaving the country, you start seeing friends leaving the country. And that experience begins to explain to you like that there are these distinctions because some people are under threat and maybe as children we don't see it. I remember the 1980s, a lot of discussions with classmates that were very close friends about are they going to move to East Beirut or not? So go to the Christian area. And the children really resisted. Like they wanted to be part of this school that they had grown up in.
In theory, Lebanon could have been a pluralistic society. Sectarianism doesn't just stem out of nowhere. So where did these divisions actually come from?
As with anything in the Middle East, the question is always, how far back do you want to go?
Dr. Emily Whalen is a senior associate at the Center for Strategic International Studies. She's a historian of U.S. foreign policy and of the Middle East.
Even before it was a state, before it was a nation, it's been a melting pot. It's been a meeting of East and West. It's been a meeting of North and South. And it's been a trading post. And it has also been occupied many times by many conquering armies.
It had been a colony under the Ottoman Empire and then later became a colony of the French Mandate after World War I.
It achieved its independence from France in 1943. And I would say it achieved its independence, but it still maintained a strongly colonial structure of government. So Lebanon's diversity, because it's been this big melting pot and this meeting point, has always sort of perturbed colonial officials. And one of the answers to this diversity was in what we call confessional politics and sectarian representation in government. On the eve of the Civil War, what you have is a very rigid, brittle, and kind of outdated political structure and a sort of system of what we would call an elite cartel. So power is shared in Lebanon among all the different confessions, but it is shared sort of at the top level, if that makes sense. There's also a really hard and increasingly and a growing gap between the elites and the rest of the country.
The reason that people will often struggle to wrap their minds around the Civil War is because of the complexity of ideologies and the religious affiliations with which they associate. And Lebanon has 18 recognized religious sects.
Think of confessions as like Muslim, Christian, Jewish, right? And then you have sects within those confessions. So the sects become more important because you get things like government concessions and positions in the government and things like that based on your sect.
And so this national pact, a power-sharing agreement, is established in 1943, which assigns various government roles among the sects. At first glance, it may look like a representative system of governance that accounts for all the different minorities. But what it actually did was lay the foundation of what would eventually become a civil war.
It's something that people will say is, distinctly Lebanese, but I see it really as a product of its colonial history. So the first real time that you have codified sort of in like legally structured sectarian representation and confessional representation is after the 1860 clashes in Mount Lebanon.
It was a conflict mainly between Maronites and Druze, and it resulted in massacres, mostly of Christians. At the time, the Ottoman rule was in steep decline, and the European powers saw this as an opportunity to undermine them.
So then there's an intervention. There's a European intervention in 1860 to stop these massacres. And the intervention establishes a confessional system of representation. If you go way back in history, Lebanon actually has a really strong history of secular government. So I see the sectarian system as really as an offshoot of colonialism, but it is one that the Lebanese elites in particular embrace, emphatically embrace, and it accords them outsized power.
This status quo simmered in the background, and for a time, it seemed that Lebanon could thrive despite it. Soon after, the country entered an era of economic boom.
A lot of people look back at what they consider Lebanon's golden age, which you could say maybe is in the 1950s and 1960s.
That's Paul Salem. He is the Vice President for International Engagement at the Middle East Institute.
Economically, at the time, while most Arab economies began to close down with socialist revolutions, nationalization, all of that, a lot of money and talent and companies moved to Beirut. And people remember that as the time when really Beirut was the hub of the Middle East in terms of banking, finance, tourism, certainly. It was also the connecting point for much of the Middle East to the world. It was a time where There was more stability than, of course, happened in the 70s. It wasn't completely stable. Obviously, we had a brief civil war in 1958, and that indicated sort of two vulnerabilities of Lebanon. One is its internal political power sharing system, but that fault line connected with an external fault line, which was at the time the rise of Jamal Abdel Nasser, the unity between Egypt and Syria, the movement for Arab nationalism. Those same dynamics appeared again in 1975, internal political problems, but then connecting with an armed Palestinian movement.
Because Lebanon is so porous and because it is the meeting point of so many things, is also heavily inflected by the wars in Palestine and in Israel. And so from 1970 onward, the commanding weight of the Palestinian Liberation Organization is based out of Lebanon and is based in Beirut. And this adds another destabilizing element to this brittle structure.
In the summer of 1967, war broke out between Israel and a coalition of Arab states, mainly Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. The Arab states suffered a humiliating defeat in just 6 days that are said to have changed the Middle East forever. The PLO, which had been controlled by Egyptian President Abdel Nasser, was taken over by Yasser Arafat and became the dominant representation for Palestinians. After the war, the PLO tried to operate out of Jordan first, but was then pushed out and transferred to Lebanon.
1969 is a pivotal moment because it's one where the PLO officially, with Egyptian and Arab support and by agreement, set up military operations in Lebanon. That really was a formula. Obviously, that creates a state within a state, that creates a loss of sovereignty, Leftism around the world and in the Arab world was at its high point. In the Arab capitals, including in Lebanon, there was kind of a concatenation, if you want, between this leftist movement, which was the global movement that connected with Palestinian nationalism and the fight against colonialism and Western imperialism. And that connected in Lebanon with the precarious domestic politics of the country.
The PLO is based in Lebanon. They are allying largely with the reform parties in Lebanon. And the reform parties are kind of a loose, sort of, I would say, center-left coalition. They have a lot of Muslims, but there are a lot of Christians as well, a lot of Druze as well. And then on the other side, you have sort of developing these increasingly right-wing, increasingly homogeneously Christian, Maronite Christian parties that are hoping to preserve, I would say, the sectarian system.
There was a trigger event in 1973. The president at the time tried to do kind of what King Hussein had done in Jordan. He tried to use the power of the state and the army to eliminate or stop the rise of this armed Palestinian PLO group, which was effectively becoming a state within the state. But then immediately the government collapsed, the prime minister resigned. It caused a huge crisis in the country, and it convinced mainly the Christian right-wing political parties that the state was not going to be able to deal with the PLO issue, that they had to form militias and they had to arm themselves. So they began arming themselves. The PLO, of course, was already armed. And then other political parties began to arm themselves. And that was the road that led to an incident on April 13, 75, a spark.
What happens in April, a bus full of Palestinians crossing the city from one camp to another, and they pass through a section of the city that is controlled by a group called the Katab, which is a right-wing Christian group. And there had been an incident earlier in the day with an attack on a Katab leader, on Pierre Gemayel, and essentially in retaliation for that attack, or perceived retaliation for the attack, the occupants of the bus are massacred.
And then all hell broke loose.
And it gets messy. Multiple factions become involved in the fighting, and despite it being a civil war, perhaps the most detrimental intervention came from outside forces.
In 1977, the election of the first right-wing government in Israel. And this is the beginning of a serious right-wing slide in Israeli politics and a real radicalization of Israel. You have people like Prime Minister Begin and Ariel Sharon are interested in is constructing a state in Lebanon that is Christian majority, that will be sort of an Israeli ally. Lebanon is not Christian majority. It never has been. And the last census in Lebanon was in 1932 to this day, and it indicates a Christian majority, but it was widely understood that was corrupted by the French officials in order to accord more power to the Maronites, who were their allies.
In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon. On the one hand, it wanted to eliminate the PLO, but it also tried to exploit the Lebanese civil war in favor of Israel's right-wing allies.
There's an effort by the Israelis to help craft this sort of almost like stage management, geopolitical stage management. And there's an effort, I think, within the United States administrations that are involved in Lebanon, which is several administrations, 4 different administrations, to just keep Lebanon weak and keep Lebanon US friendly. And you have a different version of geopolitical stage management happening in Syria as well, because what you have with Hafez al-Assad is this kind of the Syrian recidivism, where there's an effort to turn Lebanon into a vassal state of Syria.
Once the civil war erupted and Syria began to study its interests, it definitely did not want a revolutionary, a Yasser Arafat-led rump state in Lebanon at war with Israel. Lebanon is Syria's soft flank. It's a huge security risk for the Syrians. So they definitely wanted to prevent a PLO takeover of Lebanon. And from the US side, in order to secure the separate peace between Israel and Egypt, they wanted to defuse Syria and deflect it and get it mired in a war with the PLO, which anyway weakens the PLO, which the US wants, Israel wants, and gets Syria mired in the Lebanese civil war, which from the American and Israeli point of view is much better for them to be free to focus on Israel.
So you have these internal militias and you also have these outside powers, each with their own stake in the spoils of the war. But with time, alliances changed and political agendas evolved.
15 years is a long time. The war that began in 1975 is not the war that ended in 1990. It changes many times over the course of the war. And so you get people and players and parties that are important in the beginning that are less important at the end, and vice versa. So you have the breakdown of the Reform Coalition. And what you have coming up in its place is a series of other kind of versions of absolutist parties. So this is where you get the rise of Shia parties like Amal and Hezbollah. And you also get a moving away from the political agenda of the reform.
Cut a long story short, Iran, the IRGC, and so on, worked with some of the groups in Lebanon to begin setting up a new group called Hezbollah. Israel kind of welcomed the arrival of Hezbollah because effectively they were going to be fighting the PLO and for the South, for control of the South. Like Israel did not initially mind the rise of Hamas because it would weaken the PLO. The big opportunity was, of course, after the 82 invasion, and the PLO is destroyed and forced to leave Lebanon and left a huge power vacuum in southern Lebanon and in Beirut. And Hezbollah and Amal actually fought for many years to fill that vacuum. Syria largely backing Amal and Iran largely backing Hezbollah. You can say they both won in the long run. Amal ended up securing the main positions in the Lebanese government. Hezbollah continued to be the non-state actor that became the huge actor that we know today.
The division spilled from the battlefield, from inside the walls of parliament, and into the everyday lives of people. It was inescapable, and it manifests in a very tangible way.
Lebanon's a really small country. I think this is like something that people can overlook is how small it is. So for it to be carved up in different little fiefs it's almost like a reductio ad absurdum. It's ridiculous. You get a division in Beirut that kind of solidifies by 1982 between East and West Beirut. These are conventionally referred to as Muslim and Christian East, Muslim West.
There was a very quick population redistribution within Beirut where specific militias, first it was the right-wing Christian militias that sort of imposed in many neighborhoods of Beirut an eviction or massacre.
Here's Muna again.
So that was a first very harsh division, and then the lines were made clear where you can go, where you cannot go. And you needed permission to cross those lines. And you could cross those passages with a specific permit, but you were always taking a risk when you did that. So definitely the city was divided, and then the entire national territory became divided. And we really lived different histories. Like Tripoli would be in full war when Beirut was living normally. East Beirut was under the Lebanese force control. They had cinemas, they had long periods of peace, while those of us who lived in West Beirut lived with the different factions fighting each other and having street fights.
People's lives shrink, of course, to their neighborhoods and to their streets and things like that. You do have these kind of cinematic things. You've got the Green Line, which is the Damascus Street, which divides Beirut, becomes kind of like a sniper's alley. And you have, people looting these very posh hotels. And there's sort of these evocative, kind of almost glamorous views of the war. But there are also a lot of people who are just trying to live their lives.
I remember the early 1990s, a lot of essays where people would write about how much they missed the conviviality of the Civil War, playing cards in the basement. My kids call me a bunker kid because I played cards really well. And it's because for 4 or 5 days, that's all we did. We played cards. But there's a lot of it's your solidarities, everyday conviviality, a lot of great relations with neighbors.
A warmth born out of tragedy. Ali remembers a similar experience of this kind of hospitality and coming together.
When we moved from a place to another, 90% of the time we would meet with really kind and welcoming people. And we got to create many friendships across the country. And it kind of had a big impact on my character. And I think it made me more compassionate with people who face wars or who are being displaced from their homes or who had to flee war.
This sharp contradiction between the hard divisions of war and the soft, familial nature of people is baked into Lebanon's story, always at odds with each other. But for the next 5 decades, the sectarianism that fueled the war would only become more deeply entrenched into the country.
50 years later, the war is still ongoing. I don't think that the war has ended. Everything in the country is a version of the sectarian regime. For example, the government has to be equally distributed between the members of the parliament. It's 64. They have to accommodate all the sects in Lebanon, which is 18 or 19 sects. Even the military and security appointments, for example, the head of the army has to be Christian, the head of the Amn al-Am, which is the general security, has to be Shia, the head of the police has to be Sunni. It's always like this. So we were raised, imagine being raised in this environment.
So what is our state? Our state is an octopus made up of various private interest groups that are intertwined between a banking sector, a real estate sector, and a sectarian social organization that is used to reproduce the power of these individuals. So any kind of planning policy, housing loans, employment in the army, employment in teachers, infrastructure provision, housing provision, schooling, is reproduced through the power of these individuals who each had to reappoint and get credibility through that political system. And what this generates is basically then, rather than having a state that represents a common collective that wants to live together, it actually creates a collective that spreads people apart and recreates its own kind of hubs of sectarian bubbles. And those sectarian bubbles then have within them many members, constituencies that owe to the Zaim, to the leader, their jobs, their water, their electricity, the salary at the end of the month, the food they can get, the possibility to send your child to go to college, even abroad for a while.
And when you talk to these people and you tell them like you're part of this system, and the main answer is that I have to be, because if I don't do this, the share of my sect will be gone. And if you are in a position where you're part of the system and making money and you're a leader, why would you give up on it?
And this creates a divided collective. And of course, a very corrupt collective, because the principle of meritocracy doesn't exist. Instead, you've replaced it with allegiance and loyalty to those warlords.
The legacy of this corruption and the civil war eventually seeps into every facet of life, at school, at work, and in the mundane daily interactions, even in sport.
Mid-90s to end of 90s, basketball became Very, very, very popular in Lebanon. The two main teams who were competing for almost in every competition were Riyadi and Hikmeh, Sajas. Riyadi is considered a Muslim team and Hikmeh is considered a Christian team. Although the players were mixed, but every time we go and watch a game for these two teams, I can't remember a game that ended without a clash, without the army interfering, without destroying hundreds of cars outside. So you can imagine how rooted, how they planted this idea in the heads of people so they can control them.
Other times, it's not so visible, but is still ever present. Muna is a co-founder of Beirut Urban Lab. It's a research center at her university that focuses on the transformation of cities within the context of conflict and its aftermath. They conducted a survey in 2017 that perfectly captures these subtle divides. By then, Lebanon was hosting a sizable Syrian refugee population that had fled their own war at home. Many took up jobs as food delivery drivers.
So we interviewed a handful of them, more actually, and asked them to draw for us their itineraries and their landmarks in the city. And we produced this map of delivery drivers in Beirut and where do you go? And you can see that for these young men who had no idea of the Lebanese civil war, its history, when it started, how it finished, you can see that the territories they move in carve a sharp line on the dividing line of East and West Beirut of the civil war. These guys didn't know what they were doing. So they weren't saying, I don't go to Hamra or I don't go to Ashrafiyeh or you don't cross this line. What we call the green line, which is the dividing line between East and West Beirut, was super clear.
Mona says even though the dividing lines of the war may have become porous, they're still firmly in place.
Another very good example is the developers in Beirut. So again, at the Beirut Urban Lab with the housing team, we mapped all building construction in the city that was done from 1995 until 2019. And we went to the on-site and interviewed in every building to know who was the developer. We said, how about we tag every developer with his sect and we see who builds where. And so we colored the Sunnis in blue, the Shia in green, the Christians in red, and we started tagging them. And we got the exact same map of the Lebanese civil war. And so that tells you that like the market reproduces the dividing lines of the sectarian war. And same thing with our practices as city dwellers.
Corruption and clientelism became pillars of the country's politics and consequently of society. This culture dominates Lebanon for decades and creates a never-ending afterlife of this conflict. But the civil war itself did have a finite time span, 15 years.
By the end of the 1980s, what you get is a country that is functionally hollowed out. There's not much to fight over anymore. Lebanon's GDP has absolutely tanked. The infrastructure is gone functionally. And there's also been one of the largest emigrations in human history with a lot of Lebanese people leaving Lebanon. And essentially it becomes politically convenient for Syria, for Israel, and for the United States for the Lebanese war to end. The place that it comes together is that there are peace talks in a Saudi city called Taif in 1988 and 1989.
The Taif Agreement itself, when you really see what changes were introduced into the constitution, are painfully minor. In other words, really, it took 15 years of civil war and 150,000 dead, for a country ruined, economy in shambles, to do a few very, what you could say are minor things. And the distribution of quotas, sectarian quotas in parliament and government went from 6-5 in favor of the Christians to 5. That's it. Was it worth it?
Famously, the Taif Accord made provision for the desectarianization of Lebanese politics, and that has never been implemented. It remains in place to this day. The fundamental issues of the war were not resolved. The fundamental issues of the war were, how do we reform Lebanon's government to be more representative of its people? And that question gets pushed by the wayside, and it was the heart of a lot of the problems in Lebanon today.
But I would also stop and make a distinction that, no, the civil war did end. We are not in a civil war. We are in a situation which is complex. Obviously, sectarianism is still very much there. Hezbollah as a massive armed group is still there. So that part of it, you could say, is civil war-like because it is a warring group, it has guns, but it's not actively engaged in a civil war.
This state of limbo between active war and passive war, for the lack of a better term, lingers for the next 35 years. In that time, the country seems to descend further and further into crisis. Crumbling public services and infrastructure, economic turmoil, and a string of political assassinations, including the infamous killing of former Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri in 2005, who, for a brief moment, brought some prospect for reform. And it was only then that Syria was forced to withdraw its control from the country, with a UN Security Council resolution and pressure from a popular uprising dubbed the Cedar Revolution. The cycle continued, inklings of hope torn down by crisis. A year later, another war with Israel reinforces Hezbollah's power as the single deterrent against another attempted invasion of Lebanon.
People who felt for the longest time loyalty to Hezbollah because Hezbollah actually was the first time in the country's history, in the region's history, that someone imposed its deterrence power on Israel. And that is very important to account for, to understand 2019, because it was Hezbollah that defended the national government when the national government resigned in 2019. And that was what force majeure. We have to defend South Lebanon. So we need this kind of government to be able to operate the way we did. It's not convincing to me. It was never convincing to me, but that is part of the equation.
In 2019, another popular revolt erupted. It was triggered by an attempt by the state to impose a tax charge for WhatsApp. But the actual frustration was directed at government feuds and incompetence that dragged the economy down into the gutter. People called for the entire political structure to fall, and Hezbollah was caught between a rock and a hard place, trying to appeal to its constituent base while also being part of the same political system that people were rallying against. Its then leader Hassan Nasrallah warned that a government resignation would lead to chaos and the collapse of the economy. There were also fears it would create a power vacuum that would be exploited by outside powers, mainly Israel and the US. Nonetheless, Prime Minister Saad Hariri was forced to resign under pressure from the protests. What followed was a series of government stalemates and resignations. Government recklessness became more and more lethal. In 2020, a massive explosion in Beirut's port was blamed on Hezbollah for dangerously stockpiling weapons.
There's a group of warlords, and then there's a group of mafia bankers, and that's who has ruled us for the last decades. And it's the combination of this that maintained for a long time a number of narratives. Real estate in Lebanon doesn't crash. The Lebanese currency does great. Our central bank is amazing. And what is quite fascinating is that it crumbled in 2019. It crumbled in front of everyone's eyes. And yet, there's been 6 years now where they continue to maintain that status quo. And the reason is because we never held anyone accountable.
The anger festered well into the present until Israel's ongoing war on Gaza spilled over into Lebanon and changed the calculus. Hezbollah became embroiled in the war, at first only exchanging fire with Israel across its southern border. But then a series of boundless attacks by Israel brought the group to near demise. The covert pager attacks, the killing of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, bombings across Beirut, and the full-on invasion of Lebanon's south. Hezbollah, as it had been for decades, was virtually no more. A temporary and imperfect truce, heavily skewed in Israel's favor, was instead put in place.
Lebanon has signed on an agreement that stopped the war on a condition that Israel has the upper hand. It can do whatever it wants in terms of strikes and hitting and violence and occupying areas. And the next step, is to exploit it and turn it into a diplomatic achievement. There is some kind of an understanding now that Hezbollah cannot do what it claimed to be able to do a long time ago, right? And the Israelis see that there is a great opportunity to pressure the Lebanese more and more. The end goal is to try to normalize relations. But I don't think this is what the Israelis care about now. They care about starting the process of discussing diplomatic relations, even if it takes 100 years, for strategic purposes and for domestic purposes too, because Prime Minister Netanyahu can claim that we have achieved something big. We are starting diplomatic discussions with Lebanon. Does Lebanon have a say in this? I think this is the big question.
The parallel between Israel's pressure on Lebanon today and its pressure on Lebanon during the civil war are too obvious to ignore. The strategy of firepower and violence remains the same, albeit at a more intensive scale. But the circumstances now are different. For better or worse, the war has paved the way for a new dawn, and for the first time in decades, a government of a different nature was formed in Lebanon.
After the Israeli war, despite all the casualties and despite all the devastation, despite everything that has happened, there is a window of hope or opportunity to invest on the change that has started with electing a president and a prime minister who are from outside the traditional circles of power.
We have a prime minister that for the first time in my living memory is not a sectarian zaim. He's not a sectarian leader. He actually presents himself as someone who believes in a national secular identity and has demonstrated through his work, through his activism, through his presence in the ICJ, that he understands that the national secular identity doesn't mean that we have to be blind to historical conjunctures in our region. So that does make me hopeful.
At the same time, if you're going to change the country, you need to convince the people who have their grip on the country to let go. So how do you do that? They're too powerful. They're armed, they're criminals, most of them, they're warlords, so they don't care. So you can't change it unless you hit them hard where it hurts. And you know where it hurts? Money. You sanction them. You tell them you cannot leave the country. You're not welcome anywhere else. We're going to freeze your monies outside. Your families cannot travel. It's so sad saying this, by the way, but this is the reality.
It's also a moment of massive uncertainty. I don't think there's anything inherently secular or sectarian in the Lebanese identity. There's nothing unusual about people of multiple religions living together. There's always difference between people. There's no society that's fully homogeneous. And if you decide to kill the Muslim-Christian divides, you create new divides eventually. So the point being that it's a process, but change doesn't happen overnight. So maybe we can be hopeful and think that there is possibly an opportunity for Lebanon now.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines. For more on our reporting on Lebanon from the civil war to the many others that followed, visit thenationalnews.com. This episode was produced by Ban Barqawi and audio engineered by Arthur Edison, with editorial guidance from Muhammad Ali Harisi. Yasmin Al-Taji is our assistant producer and Dua Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. Thank you for listening.